When animal attacks make the headlines, usually fatal injuries are caused by some of the most impressive predators on the planet: the grizzly bear, the great white shark, or the African lion. But sometimes the most unsuspecting animals turn on humans. No matter the size or the nature of the animal, when they attack, the results can be devastating. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are 3 of the most bizarre and unusual fatal animal attacks on humans you'll ever hear. Welcome to Final Affliction. In late October 2019, 66-year-old Thomas Alexander was on the hunt. He had waited for the muzzleloader season to start in Arkansas. This allowed hunters to use older, more traditional firearms. It was perhaps a more challenging form of hunting, but so much more rewarding. Thomas set off to Yellville. He set up in a deer stand and waited. The sounds of nature surrounded him as he scoured the surroundings for any sign of a deer. His patience was rewarded when he spotted a deer emerging into a clearing. It was a buck, a magnificent sight with impressive antlers and glistening fur. Thomas's heart leapt in his chest. He raised his rifle and peered down the sight, steadying his breathing. The deer was a fair distance away, and Thomas held his nerve, waiting for the opportune moment to fire. As the deer stepped closer, its head bowed down, grazing the grasses. It was unaware of the danger, standing just yards away. When the deer raised its head, Thomas squeezed the trigger. A loud crack rang out, and the deer fell to the ground. Thomas lifted his head. It looked like a clean shot. He looked through his binoculars. The deer didn't move a muscle. Thomas climbed down from the deer stand and rested his gun against it, whilst he went to check on the buck. He was chuffed that he had secured a fine-looking specimen. He kept his eyes on the animal as he approached, but the deer wasn't dead. It heard Thomas's footsteps approaching from behind, and it suddenly clambered to its feet. Thomas was now only feet away from the animal and jumped. He was face to face with the enormous and enraged buck. Immediately it charged at Thomas, but he was so close to it that he didn't have time to dive out of the way. It drove its antlers into the hunter, and he gasped as they pierced his ribcage. He fell to the ground, and the deer gored him before leaping off and running away. Thomas was left gravely injured. He had made a serious error in judgment. He fumbled about for his mobile phone, which was in his pocket. Clasping his chest, he dialed his wife's number, and she picked up. He managed to relay what had happened, and she immediately called the emergency services. Thomas's nephew was the nearest family member to his location and rushed to the scene, arriving just before the emergency services did. Thomas was fading fast. His heart was giving out. When paramedics arrived, they requested an air ambulance, but Thomas stopped breathing and his heart stopped beating. They began CPR and instead drove him to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The hunting trip had turned into a tragedy. The deer was never found and clearly lived to graze another day. But what had happened? Nobody knows exactly. Hunters are cautioned to wait at least 30 minutes after shooting a deer before walking over to it. Had Thomas waited that long, or had he been too eager to inspect the animal and walked over sooner? Keith Steffens from the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission said that it was one of the stranger things that had happened in his 20-year career. Weighing up to 280 pounds, 127 kilograms, it is easy to see how a wounded mule deer could cause the tragic death of a human being. But this next animal is much smaller and considered one of the most unlikely species to kill a man. Once nearly hunted to extinction in Europe for their fur and scent glands, in recent years beavers have made a comeback. They have been reintroduced to some parts, and with the right management and a ban on hunting them, they are now thriving. In May 2013, a fisherman, who has not been named at the request of his family, headed to Shostakovskoye Lake, situated west of the Belarusian capital, Minsk. He and a group of friends were planning on a fishing trip, but they never made it. On the side of the road, they spotted a beaver. The cute and cuddly-looking animal was ambling about in the long grass not far from the water's edge when the friends stopped the car. It was the perfect photo opportunity. How many people can say that they've had a selfie with a beaver? Over the past decade, the beaver population in Belarus has rocketed to 80,000. They are now considered a nuisance as they are destroying forests and farms. There are so many that conflicts with humans are becoming increasingly common, and reports of aggressive beavers entering people's properties are growing. The fisherman and his friends climbed out of their car and crossed over to the other side of the road. The beaver saw them but didn't run away. The beavers in Belarus had become bold. It continued to snuffle among the grass, and the fisherman saw his opportunity. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket and strode over to the beaver. When he was just feet away, he stepped slowly closer before lunging at it and grabbing it by the scruff of the neck. With some individuals weighing up to 66 pounds, 30 kilograms, the fisherman was taken by surprise with the sheer weight and power of the animal. It thrashed around and bit him over and over. In a panic, the man dropped the beaver and it ran away, seeking refuge back in the water. But it had left a devastating and deadly mark. Renowned for chopping trees down with their incredibly powerful jaws and long, sharp teeth, the beaver had severed the man's artery in his leg. Blood spurted out, and his friends rushed to his aid. They applied pressure to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, but the blood kept coming. They knew time was against them and piled him into the back of the car and rushed to the village of Ostromenchevo and into Sulim's medical clinic. But on the way, he died from blood loss. He was the first person known to have died from a beaver attack in Belarus. Typically nocturnal animals, beavers can become disoriented when out and about during the day. They are then more likely to attack out of fear. To reduce their numbers to more manageable levels, the forestry minister is considering bringing back beaver hunting, but it is unlikely to be a popular sport, as the animals are very easy targets near dams. The goonch, otherwise known as the giant devil catfish, is a very large species of catfish. It is native to India and has caused quite a stir, owing to its immense size. Some grow as long as an adult human and weigh in excess of 220 pounds, 100 kilograms. Between 1998 and 2007, the villages along the Kali River were plagued by mysterious disappearances. Firstly, in April 1998, a group of friends were bathing in the murky waters of the river. As they splashed about just feet from the muddy bank, something approached from the depths. It had a taste for human flesh. The burnt remains of people discarded from funeral pyres along the river had been washed into the water. The predator, typically a piscivore, had grown to an exceptional size. It was larger than any specimen ever recorded before. With one gulp from its enormous mouth, it sucked one of the boys, 17-year-old Dil Bahadur, underwater right before his friends. He managed to let out half a cry before he disappeared from sight. His friends leapt out of the water and immediately raised the alarm. A search ensued, but despite 3 days of scouring the river and its banks, no trace of the boy was ever found. It was a mystery as to what had taken Dil. His friends hadn't seen the knobbly back of a crocodile or the dorsal fin of a bull shark. The currents in the river were non-existent in that particular stretch. Something out of the ordinary had taken him that afternoon, but nobody knew what. The river was considered relatively safe for locals to swim and bathe in, but just 3 months later, the mysterious creature struck again. This time it took place at Dharma Ghat. A man and his young son were bathing in the water. Their splashes were detected by the covert predator, and it moved in for the kill. Silently and rapidly, the young boy was pulled under the water just feet from his horrified father. The man scrabbled about in the river, trying desperately to grab hold of his son, but the brown water made it impossible to see. Yet another frantic search ensued, but no remains of the boy were ever found. People became cautious about entering the river. What had once been a safe and enjoyable activity was now something that could cost them their lives. But as the months passed and turned into years, people began to feel safe again in the Kali River. Whilst the families of those who disappeared would never forget, others did, until the creature struck again. This time, in 2007, an 18-year-old Nepalese man was enjoying the river amongst friends when he suddenly felt something grab him around the waist. In an instant, he was pulled below the surface of the water and disappeared without a trace. When word spread about the mysterious river monster, British biologist Jeremy Wade offered to investigate. He was determined to catch whatever it was that was responsible for the attacks. No one had seen anything other than a flash of gray when one of the victims was dragged down. It wasn't much to go on. But what Jeremy did was consider all the things it could possibly be. He examined the stretch of river where the attacks had taken place. It was only a 4-mile length of river. At first, he thought the most likely explanation was a whirlpool or unexpected water currents. For the victims to be dragged underwater almost silently, without a ferocious amount of splashing, as is often the case with a shark attack, water currents seemed to be the logical explanation. But that particular stretch of river had no turbulence in it. Intrigued by the mystery, Jeremy began listening to villagers. Many of them believed it was a goonch. During his investigation, a domestic water buffalo weighing 350 pounds, 160 kilograms, was dragged into the water as it took a drink in the shallows. For an animal that size to be seized by a predator, Jeremy estimated the catfish needed to be 300 pounds, 135 kilograms. He now knew that he was looking for a monster. Saltwater crocodiles were dismissed, as they never traveled that far upriver. Gharials didn't have a large enough jaw to take a grown man, and the water was too cold for mugger crocodiles. No locals had ever seen crocodiles basking on the banks in the sun either. Bull sharks were also dismissed, as it was so far upriver, and nobody had ever seen a dorsal fin break the surface, despite the shallow water where the attacks took place. Maybe the locals were right. Maybe the giant devil catfish was responsible. Jeremy set up a funeral pyre to lure one of the catfish. Sure enough, a record-breaking goonch was captured the next day. It measured 6 feet 7 inches and weighed 160 pounds, 73 kilograms. It was certainly large enough to take a small child, but to take a fully grown man and a water buffalo, the goonch would have to be much larger. The cases have remained unsolved, but after the investigations, most, including Jeremy, believe that the goonch was responsible for the attacks that brought so many people in the river to their terrifying final affliction.